Welcome to our second installment of Suitable for Adults, a grown-up look at children's Bible stories. Today, I'm here in LPC's library with one of our children's favorite toys here at the church, Noah's Ark, because today we're going to look at the story of Noah. First, here's a little trivia for you to play along with. We'll find out the answer towards the end of our segment.
The Lord said to Noah, there's gonna be a flooding.
Noah's Ark usually brings up images of beautifully colored scenes filled with animals in pairs happily trotting onto the packed ark, and rainbows and birds and promises filled with God's love. It's one of the more popular images that are reserved for babies, nurseries, infants' toys, and things like that. But just like this ark is packed with so many little animals, there's a lot more to this story that we can unpack as adults. First, let's take a look at the type of writing that Noah's Ark comes from. It's found in the book of Genesis, chapters 6 through 9. Genesis is labeled as one of the books of law, just as Jonah was labeled as one of the minor prophets. This is because it's the first book in the Jewish Pentateuch and Torah. Since it comes from the Jewish tradition, it's worth noting how it's viewed in that faith. Jewish scholars treat these stories as allegory, used to show humanity's relationship with its creator and the laws and setup of justice between us and him. When describing why many Jewish teachers don't teach this story as pseudo-history, the way that our faith tends to often, one rabbi said, "Why bother teaching something to children that they must then unlearn as adults?" So, as we briefly discussed in Jonah, many creationist groups take some of these early stories as accurate retelling of history. There are studies dedicated to proving that a boat this size could indeed hold two of every creature on Earth. There have been expeditions to the Mount of Ararat searching for fragments of what could be the ship, and there's even a theme park that has attempted to rebuild the ark in full scale, complete with animals and a museum of what's the creator version of history. So let's look at some possibly more rational facts that could point to this as being a possible connection to a historical event. There are several flood stories around the world in many cultures. Many of them are a part of the origin story, similar to our Adam and Eve, and some of them come a little bit later within their myth and culture. The one that probably is most well known and probably connects most to the story of Noah is the story of Gilgamesh. So let's take a look at that story.
The Epic of Gilgamesh is a similar flood story that has been compared to the Christian flood story. It's worth noting that it was found in the mid-19th century in the Library of Nineveh, Nineveh being the same as we discussed in the Jonah story. And it was written in two languages, the Akkadian language and the Sumerian language. And Sumer is where the flood is most likely to have taken place. And it's good to know also that of those cuneiform languages, one actually does more relate to the early forms of Aramaic. And many of these cultures did, through time, exchange business and other things, as we see again with our story of Jonah much later. We know that those cultures did interact through war and etc. Now that could mean a couple of things. It could mean that the story began as a Sumerian story and then was adapted for Christian purposes, or for Hebrew purposes rather, within the Bible, or it could mean that those peoples all originate from about the same location and therefore all have similar takes on the same story. Now, the story of Gilgamesh is contained in 12 tablets. And as I said before, it's an epic poem that was done in cuneiform, which is one of the earliest types of writing. It's about the deluge, which overthrew the land. The gods appoint one man who they find to be superior to the rest because of all of the sin that is in that region, and they decide to, just the same as our story, flood the earth. So there are a lot of similarities. Both Genesis version and the Gilgamesh version are considered to be a global flood. So within the known world, at least within that time, the cause is man's wickedness in Genesis and man's sin in Gilgamesh. Genesis, God speaks directly to Noah, whereas Gilgamesh, the hero, receives his message in a dream. However, we also know that God speaks directly to us through dreams. Both were ordered to build a boat. Both complained about having to do that task. They both take only their families. They both take all species of animals and experience heavy rain, although the Genesis version also discusses groundwater issues and flooding. The length of time in the floods are different, but they both release birds. In Noah's case, it's a raven and 3 doves. In Gilgamesh's story, it's a dove, a swallow, and a raven. It's important to note that early fishermen and sailors often used birds to detect if there was land nearby. And both land on a mountain once the area is flooded. Both also give a sacrifice, and both are blessed in certain ways afterwards. So Noah gets his promise through the rainbow, but in the Gilgamesh story, the hero, I believe, is offered eternal life. So there are some differences, but there are a striking number of similarities within this. Now, scholars have talked about how this myth came to be, and what we've found is there was actually a large flood within this area of Mesopotamia. In fact, where the people of Samaria came from, it's likely that at one point in time the flooding was so drastic that you would see about 1 meter a day, and this would have been because of the global warming at this time. Nearing the end of the Ice Age is when this story is said to have taken place. And so there was a drastic rise within the sea levels in that area. So this leads to a lot of both Nineveh's mythology and the people of Samaria and Acadia. For instance, people might actually have appeared to be walking out of the sea because the water was rising at such a fast pace and people were constantly on the move to try and get away from those floods. The people further out, like the Akkadians, would have seen the Sumerians appearing to be walking from out of the sea. And so some of their earliest creation stories also contain a sort of fish man, a half man, half fish that comes out and gives life to the new people, which is also said to be one of the reasons why the people in Nineveh would have accepted some story from a man like Jonah, said to have come from a fish, easier than something else, some other miracle or story, is because they would have been expecting that of their creator to come from this fishman. So that's the link to Gilgamesh and the Noah story, and there are parallels to some archaeological fact in that this region did flood. Now, was it the whole world? It would have been at least the known world, then. So in a sense, we can have sort of an early flood story. So that's possibly where this originates from.
Now, whether we believe that there is truth in this story, that it is a part of history, or if it's pure allegory, the story has been used throughout centuries to give moral lessons primarily to children. The story has changed through the generations, and the focus has changed as to what's been told. Like classic fables that we find in many of our children's books, we tend to start with a harder lesson learned and then end up in a more modern, softer image of love and faithfulness. For example, in mythology and in classic fairy tales, for instance, Red Riding Hood was originally a story that warned against prostitution and against witchcraft, both signified by Little Red Riding Hood's red cape. And the wolf in the story would have been the devil consuming them due to their evil. That's definitely not the story that most of us teach to our children today. Similarly, in a more Puritan era, Noah was really a story of a wrathful, vengeful God who regretted having ever made us, wiped the earth clean of all humanity except for the one good family that he could find, which was Noah's. Other stories that have emerged from the more wrathful and vengeful themes in Noah take on more the message of obedience. Noah trusted and was obedient to God, even though he had no idea of the danger really that was posed to him had he not completed that ark. Having faith and trusting in God is an important thing within our faith, and definitely something that we should teach and pass on to our children and remember for ourselves. Hard work being rewarded is another lesson that's often taught with this. And not only that the good get rewarded, but the wicked get their just deserts as well in this story. Care of animals and care of God's creation is another theme that's been pulled from this story. Very early on, this theme was adopted, and even more recently, within some of our UN global warming talks, this verse was pulled out as a message to us for what we might cause on the earth should we not remember to care for God's planet, just as Noah cared for the animals on the ark. Keeping promises, particularly God keeping promises, is a big deal within this book as well. He creates the covenant with Noah before he even builds the ark, and then solidifies that through what we know as the Noahic covenant, which is the sending of the rainbow. So let's take a look at a few of the lessons taught over time, and also a few of the things that are typically left out of our children's versions. We all probably remember the story starting out with God being angry with all of the wicked people, and only Noah was good enough to be saved with his family, telling him to build an ark, a boat large enough for him to send 2 of each animal to be saved, 40 days and nights being left on that ark, and we remember even the birds going out and coming back to signal whether there was dry land or not. We might remember Noah's sacrifice of thanksgiving at the end and remember to be grateful for the strife that we come through. And of course we remember the cheery rainbow at the end that tells us that God will never wipe the earth clean again. But go back, read it again on your own as an adult. So we have the idea that Noah was some sort of sinless hero. He was definitely not. It only actually says he was a good man. It never says he was without sin. Also, it does not say in the Bible that people laughed at him, that he heroically kept building that boat despite all of the horrible treatment from all of the neighboring citizens. There are accounts of that later in other stories, but it's not in the original account. So the heroizing of Noah and many of our other typical Bible stories, especially for children, lead us into some very dangerous territory. So let's skip over the main part of the story, the part that we mostly know, and keep in mind that, of course, there are some things even with that we forget. The horrors and the reality of flooding. Even after the sacrifice, the recovery of the land and the trauma that they had been through in isolation, through death, and the beginning again of a whole new culture. This was not such a happy walking out onto the earth and having it prepared for them. I'm sure there was some grieving in that process. But let's skip to the end of the story, though that might even add to what happens next. This part is almost always left out of our children's versions as well.
The sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These were the 3 sons of Noah, and from them came the people who were scattered over the earth. Noah, a man of the soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard. When he drank some of its wine, he became drunk and lay uncovered inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness and told his 2 brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it across their shoulders. Then they walked in backward and covered their father's nakedness. Their faces turned the other way so that they would not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine, he found out what his youngest son had done to him. He said, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will be born to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the slave of Shem. May God extend the territory of Japheth. May Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his slave."
Now, one might be a little confused by this passage that we just read. We see here that Noah, the good Noah, is drunk. And why does he become so angry enough in this drunkenness, when it should seem like an error on his part to be passed out and have his sons come and cover him? Why is he so angry to curse his own grandson? And not even just the son who committed the sin. Well, scholars point to similar passages within the Bible that help us unfold what happened. It is thought here that Ham, upon finding his father naked, had sex with him, and then told his brothers, who then came and covered him to cover the shame. There are similar scenes in the story of Lot. After the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot flees with his daughters and his wife is turned to salt, his daughters also make him drunk, and in order to preserve their wine, they both sleep with him as well. And many Bibles, if you look in the footnotes, you'll see a link between those 2 stories. It'll link them. In the Noah story, however, Noah wakes up knowing what happened to him, whereas Lot has no idea what happened. This would explain the curse of an entire generation. Early on, in some of the earliest laws within the Bible, we know that incest is very poorly looked upon. It's one of the top sins that you can do, and is one of the things that connects it with the sin of Lot's daughters. So this would explain why he would be so angry than just being shamed or just being disrespected as a father, which is another common theme that people like to pull out of there. The punishment, though, does not go directly to Ham, who committed the sin, but goes to his son Canaan. And so Noah, who loses all hope of having his son's line being honorable, now passes that same sadness on to his son Ham in Canaan, because now Canaan is also not going to be honorable. So that's actually the punishment for Ham, is to see that his son has no hope. It's more of a punishment for himself. And the line of Cain then goes to become Canaan, and the Canaanite people, who would later be in constant battles with the Hebrew people. And this is one of the stories that also helped perpetuate the phrase, the sins of the father, that pass on to those of the children. Now, though this isn't often taught to children, especially in our more modern times and softer versions of the story, it has crept into Christian history and some children's Christian Bibles. Noah's drunkenness and reintroduction of sin into the world after it has just been cleansed of all sin becomes a basis during the temperance movement. So they tended to use this idea of alcohol being the cause of all of the sin as a reason not to drink during the temperance movement. The idea of Ham's crime against Noah and the punishment that then followed through the generations has also been used to justify slavery. It was said that Ham was translated to mean burnt, and that when Ham was cursed by his father's punishment, that his skin darkened. This line created the first people of color, a people of wickedness, and those people deserved perpetual punishment. Listen to this excerpt from George Peltz's Grandpa's Stories, or Home Talks of the Wonderful Book, an early children's Bible storybook published in 1887.
In this retelling of Noah by Peltz, he tries to insinuate that there is no sin on or misdoing on Noah's part. In fact, there's a long, drawn-out segment where he talks about Noah's creation of the wine, saying that it was a mistake, that he had made too much grape juice and some fermented, and not knowing what it was like to taste or drink fermented juice, he took of some of it and he became drunk. And so therefore it's not his fault because it was purely accidental. He then links this to, well, maybe he should have joined the temperance movement. Then he would have known that all evil comes from alcohol. But he goes further, basically just nullifying any possible misdeed by Noah and putting it all on Ham. And he doesn't insinuate at all what some of the scholars say currently about it, but instead describes it as an unworthy act of a son who is dishonoring his father. So the grandpa in the story answers a question and says, Noah was their father and they honored him, meaning the second sons who covered him up. Even when he was drunk, Grandpa tells the grandchildren that though Noah became drunk by accident, Ham's conduct was not an accident. He had made fun of his father. It was base and unworthy act, and God is angry with every child who does not honor his father and mother. And through this story, he then teaches the children that failing to honor one's parents is enough to anger God, to bring on this judgment for not only yourself, but through your entire family. Next, he goes on to describe what that punishment was. But in what way was Canaan cursed, Grandpa? What harm came to him? Asked Carrie. From him descended those nations, the Africans, for instance, which have always been born the servants and burden-bearers of the world. That seems too bad, said both girls together. But Ham was a mean, bad man, added Mary. To which Charlie added, very solemn, "That's so." The grandpa character uses the curse upon Canaan to explain the enslavement of Africans.
It is absolutely worth noting that scientific study into the DNA of people in the land of Canaan did not actually have dark skin, no darker than anyone else who would have also been from the lines of Noah's other children. That has actually been disproved. It's also worth noting that Ham does not translate in those languages to burnt. When in our culture we look to identify with certain characters, and especially when we disregard those characters' sins and we make them holier than maybe they even were, that Noah was such a hero and such a good man that nothing bad could come from him, and therefore we, the white man or the white people, have come from the line of Noah, but only then where does the sin come from? It must come from the black line. That is where it becomes dangerous to start to twist the Bible into your own interpretations to suit your needs in the time. This shows the dangers of hero worship within our faith. The incapability of Noah to do wrong supports that idea of white supremacy. We'll talk more about the idea of false perfection in our next segment on David and Goliath. But it does connect to Noah and to Jonah as well. None of these heroes were sinless or perfect. So what can we learn from this story today? Many of the lessons I mentioned before are wonderful about obedience, faith, care for the animals and the earth. The story, those lessons are great to take out of it, and we as adults can learn those too. It's also been claimed that the story is just a mimicking of the creation story, only in reverse. Instead of starting with the waters being parted to make those of the sea and those of the sky, and ending with the sin of man, here we start with the sin of man. We go through the process of the animals being taken care of, and we end with those waters coming back down from heaven and up from earth to flood and bring us back to a new beginning. Of the theories that I've read, I like the idea of the story of Noah being like baptism. That once the covenant is made with God, like Noah first made the covenant when he accepted to build the ark, that the sin of our lives is washed away. And though we may sin again, because like Noah, we are not perfect, and just being Christian does not make us so, God does still keep his covenant with us and will not destroy us again. That really is a great takeaway for us as adults. Christians like to pretend sometimes that we are perfect, that we make no mistakes once we pledge that we are going to follow Christ. But we do falter. And yet, God is constant. We, like those Christians who tried to use our faith in a way to subjugate others, we make misinterpretations. We make bad mistakes within our faith, and we are not heroes. We're not perfect. We are human, and we are imperfect, and we do make mistakes, but the point is that we try to do better each time, and that God will keep that promise, that he will not wash us away again, that we will not be destroyed in the end, and that rainbow is our promise for salvation when the time comes. So I hope that you have learned something from this story of Noah's Ark, a few of the details that maybe you weren't so familiar with before from your childhood stories. And please join me again for our next segment on David and Goliath. We'll learn a little bit more about how this hero maybe wasn't as heroic all the time as we thought. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me at the email address below, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
The Lord said to Noah,